In addition to having a difficult time getting quality childcare during working hours, women also had trouble overcoming cultural prejudices that were negative towards working women. And the scenario was much worse throughout the war years. Women experienced prejudice and displacement. The narrative of the Soviet military women who were taken by German Nazis who didn't care if it was a lady or a child is similar. The Nazis saw men as somewhat useful while considering women as nothing more than a 5-minute source of pleasure that could be shot without consequence. Operation Barbarossa, the German Army's 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22nd. It faced a challenging scenario that it had never encountered before in Poland, France, or the Low Countries: female enemy combatants. The Eastern Front War was a clash of ideologies between German National Socialism and Soviet Communism. Both sides despised each other in a way that was far more intense than the warfare between the Germans and the British. Apart from their obvious racial and political animosities, the Red Army's use of women in combat was what really repulsed the Germans. The Nazi Party's ideas about the proper roles and places for women in society forced the Germans to recruit tens of thousands of women throughout the war in order to free up more men for combat. But with a few notable exceptions to this rule, women served as nurses, clerks, river navigators, searchlight operators, and other non-frontline posts. The Germans didn't believe that a woman belonged to the front lines, but the Soviet Union, on the other hand, saw men and women as basically equal. Certainly equal enough for women to carry guns, fight alongside men, and defend the homeland, and serve in types of female military posts found in German, British, and American armed forces. Russian women troops flew fighters and bombers, and there was even a bomber squadron that Germans mockingly dubbed the Night Witches. In 1942, the first Red Army unit to face German panzers as they neared Stalingrad was staffed by female soldiers. Of course, women snipers were also well known, and many of them gained terrifying reputations and high kill totals. In total, about 1 million Soviet women served during World War II, and nearly 200,000 of them were decorated, with 89 of them receiving the highest award given by the Soviet Union for valor and meritorious service. The Nazi forces' meddling, however, prevented these ladies from reaching the heights of their potential. A 1976 publication by Daniel Grant and Claudia Vilor, the documentary story of the Soviet, provides evidence of how the Germans treated captive military women. The book goes into great detail of how a 35-year-old lady was taken prisoner during a difficult struggle with Wehrmacht forces. Then, in 1976, it was absurd since such a subject was prohibited. The recollections of ladies who had been held captive by the Germans were filled with far too much cruelty. The few people who survived had too much terror and misery, and Claudia Vilor's story is no different. There had already been much written about the horrific treatment that the Nazi prisoners of war suffered, but because it would be uncomfortable to discuss or write about girls or women, they were rarely mentioned. Nevertheless, there were many women serving on the front lines of the Second World War as snipers, nurses, pilots, signalers, and anti-aircraft gunners. Despite the fact that Germany was a member of the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, its provisions were not upheld on the Eastern Front. Thus far, we are unaware of a lot regarding what the Germans did to female service members and, when they were captured by them. According to the Third Reich's objectives, the slots were almost entirely exterminated. The slots, by the way. Just want to make that clear. Therefore, there was little use in caring for prisoners of war, for it being even an unspoken command. This theory, which was founded on practical concerns, claimed that women wearing military clothes were equivalent to partisans and were liable to a swift death. Women typically perished from overwork since males in the concentration camp could be utilized for hard work. 1 million women participated in the Soviet Army during World War II, and 80,000 of them earned officer positions. However, the Third Reich did not see women as full-fledged soldiers, putting them on par with the partisans who served as the forest bandits for the Nazis. Simply put, there was never a formal directive from the Third Reich's leadership on how to handle female military members. If there had been, it had been destroyed. However, in the records of the 4th Nazi Army, which was part of the Center Group, there is a memorandum approved by Field Marshal General Gunther von Kluge, adding his personal opinion that women in military wear were to be shot rather than arrested. It may be inferred that other Wehrmacht formations had identical commands as the level of individual forces. It's difficult to estimate the number of Soviet women who perished in this manner during the early stages of the war. Situations in which they were kidnapped and taken to detention camps up until 1944 were an exception. Everything came to an end much sooner. Hundreds of Soviet girls perished on the battlefields and suffered Nazi retaliation. According to Soviet Army servicemen who discovered numerous female corpses near Moscow during the invasion of 1941 in December, they were women soldiers who were held in captivity by the Germans, and the majority of them were bullied. Many of the women suffered ahead of their deaths as a result of being tortured and bullied, and God knows what else. For Soviet female soldiers, being imprisoned in a concentration camp was far worse than dying on a battlefield. Massacres were commonplace in concentration camps, but there were cases when SS officers were moved by the fearlessness of Soviet women and intervened. One such major Soviet officer was brought to the Sutov concentration camp in 1944 and was repeatedly bullied. They forced her to remove her clothes, took pictures of her, and laughed at her helplessness. Eventually, she couldn't take it any further and spat in the face of the tormentor. So, in 1943, at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, captive nurses began to reject German instructions and refused to sew uniforms for the Nazis, claiming that military forced labor is illegal under the Geneva Convention. The ladies were thus famished, driven to the encampment, and made to march in the chilly wind without clothing. However, the women started to sing in unison, and the other inmates heard them and poured out of the barracks to cheer the marchers. When the concentration camp commandant came on the scene of the disturbance, he put an end to the punishment. He gave everyone the go-ahead to return to their stations and sent them out to work at their other professions without forcing them to sew German uniforms. There was only one specialized concentration camp for women in Germany, Ravensbrück, and over 130,000 women passed through it through the war years, while 92,000 women perished from fatigue, infections, and bullying. Women, especially a group of nurses and signalers who took part in the fight for Crimea, came from the Soviet Union. In February 1943, they were transported to a concentration camp and housed in different sections from the others, which likely had worse circumstances for survival. The imprisonment circumstances in Ravensbrück were better than in conventional concentration camps, but this didn't apply to the female service members. Wherever they went, humiliation awaited them, and many would die. They frequently suffered abuse at the hands of SS retinue guards, in addition to dying from hunger. It wasn't until the end of the war, in the autumn of 1944, when the Germans were already sensing their impending defeat, that a special order was signed for the German security service stating that women captives of war should be kept in the same conditions as men. As long as they were Jewish or political activists, they should have been executed. It's crucial to observe, nevertheless, this order came too late for the majority of the military girls, who had already passed away in Nazi concentration camps. Some female Soviet troops were horribly assaulted sexually before murdered, while others were taken prisoner and instead given over to the SS since the army lacked facilities for female prisoners of war. The majority of these unfortunate women were sent to one of Germany's largest concentration camps for women, Ravensbrück, or the Auschwitz-Birkenau women's camp. Roughly 18,000 Soviet female prisoners of war were held at various points, and many of them committed suicide when facing capture, while the Germans killed thousands of others. According to Israeli historian Aaron Schneer, who composed the book Captivity, every woman entering a concentration camp was examined by a gynecologist. German medical professionals were shocked to learn that 8 out of the 10 Soviet captives who were single and unmarried were virgins, and for them it became a punishment. As a result, more frequently than other prisoners of war, Soviet women were the targets of Nazi assault. There were quite a few of them, since over 1 million Soviet women fought in the war. As a consequence, those who survived the conflict were taken suffered terrible conditions, and at times women even harbored envy against their perished colleagues. Despite facing such hardships, the Soviet women combatants showed valor and they sacrificed for their country. These women's tales ought to be heard, remembered, exalted. So, what are your opinions on this heartbreaking story of the Soviet women?